Welcome, everybody, to the fourth in this series of conversations about human brains produced by Fondazione Prada. So, this evening, I'm joined by two experts to discuss music, language, and the brain. We'll be taking the long view and looking at how music and language evolved over time, over thousands of years. And we'll look at how our brains process music and language today, and also explore how music can be used as therapy as well. I'm joined by Steve Mithen, who's Professor of Early Prehistory at the University of Reading in the UK, and Stefan Koelsch, who is Professor of Biological Psychology and Music Psychology at the University of Bergen in Norway. So I hope you've already had the chance to watch the two short lectures by Professor Mithen and Professor Koelsch. But just to refresh those ideas, they'll start by summarising their lectures. And this live session then is a chance for you to ask questions of both of the experts. So please do send in your questions via the chat box, and I will direct those to our experts tonight. Just to flesh out that introduction, Stefan Koelsch is Professor of Biological Psychology and Music Psychology at the University of Bergen. He has a background in music, psychology, and sociology. He did his PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience in Leipzig in Germany, where he also led a research group focusing on the neurocognition of music. He worked at Harvard Medical School, McMaster University, the Free Universität Berlin, and Lancaster University before assuming his post at the University of Bergen. His research interests range across the neurocognition of music, the neural correlates of emotion, music therapy, and the similarities and differences between music and language processing. He's produced seminal work in this area, and his publications are amongst the most widely read in music psychology and the neurocognition of music. He is a consummate expert in the field. Steve Mithen is another consummate expert. He's Professor of Early Prehistory at the University of Reading in the UK. He's a field archaeologist with long-term projects in Western Scotland and southern Jordan, from whence he's recently returned, focusing on prehistoric hunter-gatherers and the transition to farming societies in the Neolithic. Professor Mythen is also a pioneer of cognitive archaeology, seeking to use evidence from the fossil and archaeological records to understand how the human mind has evolved. And he's always had a particular interest in language and in music. His books include The Prehistory of the Mind, published back in 1996, After the Ice, A Global Human History, and the wonderful Singing Neanderthals. He was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2004. So now we've met our experts, or at least been introduced to them. Stefan, could I ask you to start us off by just giving us a very brief summary in just a few minutes of your lecture?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Alice, for this wonderful introduction. In my lecture, the first point I was trying to make is that humans hold a pulse in a group. So we can clap together in synchrony. And what seems very trivial to us is also unique species, or let's say no other vertebrate species can do this. And I think that holding a pulse or a beat flexibly is perhaps the simplest mental function that just separates us from animals. And viewed in this slide, music was the decisive evolutionary step from animals to humans. Another point, when we make music together in a group, it unites us, it stimulates social bond. And when we bond with others, it elicits positive emotions, fun, joy, sometimes even happiness. These emotions support our health and our well-being. And all this was important in the evolution of humans because bonding, the cooperation that comes with it, the trust and peacefulness that comes with it, and health brought humans an important advantage to live longer. I also think that music was the main mechanism for social bonding in large groups during the evolution of humans, because individuals can make music group and thus establish and foster social relationships. So this makes music an obvious candidate to social networks and to increase social cohesion in large groups. And therefore, I have proposed the grooming hypothesis to explain the emergence of music, analogous to the vocal grooming hypothesis for the emergence of language. Another point, music together means producing sounds at the same time, and that is afforded by music's fundamental structure: pulse, the beat, or the tactus on the one hand, and scale on the other. These two principles build the nucleus of a universal musical grammar. And out of this nucleus, a seemingly infinite number of musical systems and compositions evolve. Another point in my lecture is that only one individual can speak at a time. Both talk across each other, we can't understand what they say, and it doesn't sound good. And with music, individuals can produce sounds at the same time, and it still makes sense. And in this regard, I said that music of the individual and music is the language of the group. And this also brings along another interesting language and music. For language, semantics is more important than syntax. And for hand, syntax is more important than semantics, because without syntactic structure, we could sounds together. Thus, without semantics, there's no language, and without no music. However, because language is a special kind of music, music of specific meanings, the brain basis for language and music is largely overlapping. Separate brain networks, there's one single music-language network in the brain, one that language only that language is processed more strongly in the left side of the brain and music in the right side of the brain. I'm already going over time. I made another. Music are both part of our human nature. That's also important because that means that we positive effects of music, the good vibrations of the music, positive, more cheerful, switch off worries, really has health supporting effects. And the last point in my lecture, emotion signals in our voices are biological signals, that this is one of the reasons why the sound of the voice and especially of the sing moves us.
Thank you so much for that, Stefan. We've got a bit of a connection problem tonight, so occasionally you were cutting out, so my own language processing was having to work overtime, but I think that we could all grasp exactly what you were saying. And your lecture was fantastic. I love the way that you range across that science. You look at the way that the brain processes language and music, but then you're really interested in how to use music as therapy as well. So it really feeds back into well-being in our modern population as well. Now to take us back into the deep past. Thanks, Stefan. Now to take us back into the deep past, I wonder, Steve, if you could just briefly summarize your lecture.
Thank you, Alice. And let me thank the opportunity to participate in this great event tonight. Well, I'm an archaeologist, and my interests are in the relationship between language, music, and thought. And I'm interested in those because I don't think we can understand past behavior and all the artifacts we find in the archaeological record without asking about language and thought. But equally, I don't think we can understand their relationship today unless we think about these from an evolutionary point of view. People have debated the relationship between language and thought for many years. And I think the writers in the 17th and 18th century, like Vico and Herder and Rousseau, still have a great deal to offer. And I'm interested in combining their ideas with the evidence from the archaeology and the evidence of the latest research in neuroscience, such as Stefan has been undertaking. Now, as an archaeologist, my challenge is to recognize when language appears in the archaeological record. And that's not easy because the artifacts and the fossils we dig up are all absolutely silent. We can't hear them speak to us. But when I look at all the evidence, I think it's really clear that something fundamental happens in the human mind or society around soon after 100,000 years ago, because it's after that we get the first appearance of pigment use and what we call symbols and art. And it's when Homo sapiens disperses out of Africa and into Eurasia, into Europe, and eventually into the Americas. And there's a huge cultural ratchet event that starts happening, and culture progresses. And soon we get the invention of cave art, and then when the Holocene starts, farming, and then cities and so forth. So I think that stage, just after 100,000 years ago, marks the appearance of spoken language that we have today. Now, that raises the question of how did our earlier ancestors and our relatives, such as earlier Homo sapiens and Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, communicated to each other? And my research has led me to think that this was a communication that had a very musical nature. Rather than having any words, they had holistic phrases, and they made extensive uses of variations in pitch and rhythm. They used gesture and mimesis. And this was a really sophisticated type of communication. It was a form of language, but not like language as we know it today. And I think that that type of communication gave rise to both language and music in Homo sapiens and in the modern world. And research by neuroscientists such as Stefan and others have now demonstrated the overlap in the brain of music and language processing. Both music and language seem to have a hierarchical structure. They're processed in the same parts of the brain. And I think this reflects their common origin. Although I actually would think that musicality comes first, and the type of syntactical nature that we find in music that the brain evolved to process actually gave rise at a later date to the grammar that we have in spoken language. So up until 100,000 years ago, I think all of our ancestors and relatives were communicating this musical-like mode of language. And then around 100,000 years ago, probably a community, might be an individual, somewhere in Africa, invented the idea of words. And words transformed the nature of communication. And where they're combined with that syntactical property that was already in the brain, we have a combination of words, a lexicon, and grammar that creates compositional language, such as that we have today. And that really transformed the way we think. It enabled new concepts to be invented, better communication, new ways of perceiving the world. And basically, it was a new world. And that enabled this great dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa, the colonization of the New World in Australia, the invention of farming, and so forth. So to summarize, I think the earliest form of communication was musical in nature that gave the cognitive basis for the syntax that we later use in language that appeared after words were invented. And I'd say the invention of words was probably the greatest invention of humankind. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. I mean, listening to both your lectures and your fantastic potted summaries there, I think it makes us think about music very differently. I think there's a tendency to think about music as being something perhaps a bit frivolous. You know, it's just about entertainment. You mentioned it, Stefan, in your lecture, the phrase mental cheesecake, I think. And what you're both saying is that it's much more than that, and potentially incredibly important in human evolution and to the success and even the survival of our species. So we've got some questions coming in from people who are watching. And before we get into those, I'd like to ask each of you if you've got questions for each other. I know that you're very familiar with each other's research, but Steve, have you got a question for Stefan?
Yes, I would. Stefan, it's been great meeting you over this Zoom and talking with you over the last few days. As you know, I'm hugely impressed and to some extent dependent on your work, because you've demonstrated this overlap of processing of music and language in the brain. What you have argued is that music has a hierarchical structure, much a way that spoken language has hierarchical structure. But I've noticed that your experimental work tends to draw on Western music, and especially work by composers such as Bach, that we know to be quite well structured. But I'd like to ask whether you think all music from all cultures all over the world have a similar hierarchical structure, rather than it being a sort of a consequence of the Western tradition, if you like, and the particular types of composition that Bach liked to compose, and that appealed to the 18th century, 19th century, audience.
Yes. Yeah. Short answer is certainly not. That is not all musical styles and not all kinds of musics have a hierarchical structure. Perhaps I should just briefly explain to the listeners what actually with hierarchical structure. So, for example, consider the sentence, "Who kissed the girl had..." No, let's say the boy who kissed the girl played. Now, the relative clause, "who kissed the girl," is embedded in the main clause. The boy plays. We recognize this and know that the boy plays cello. We can understand the hierarchical structure, and it seems that humans are rather regard. Otherwise, we would hear that the girl plays cello. Because let's say a computer who's not capable of processing hierarchical structure, then the computer would hear the boy who kissed the cello. So then the girl plays cello. So also we can leave out the subordinate clause and still it makes sense. So then the boy plays cello. That still has meaning for us. And therefore we use the term hierarchy. An action sequence can be hierarchically organized. Let's say I start making a coffee, I realize, oh, I powder, I go to the supermarket, get the coffee, I come back, and I continue to make the coffee with the machine. Now, if a melody has a beginning, a middle, and an end, then we can recognize a hierarchical structure. So the middle can be an embedding with harmonies from a different key, for example. So we begin in one key, go to another, and return to the home key. That's in melody. There are many folk melodies case, many other melodies where this is not the case. So a lot of tonal music shows a structure which we can describe in hierarchical terms. Certainly all music by Bach. Bach always returns to the home key or the parallel major key in minor pieces. Also, almost all music shows this organization. But there are many kinds of music that do not show this kind of organization. So, for example, my group once conducted a northern Cameroon with members of the so-called Mafa tribe, and their music was not hierarchically organized. It was circular, that is, it was a repeating motive, and this is typical African musical styles. And I'm not surprised that many musics actually do not have a strict hierarchically organized. We hear hierarchical organization only on relatively short timescales, that is within a couple of notes or chords. Only individuals with so-called they can really hear whether the hierarchical structure of a longer harmonic sequence is concluded, that is hierarchically correct or not. So it is played with well-tempered tuning. But all other listeners, that is 99% of the audience, would not recognize if a Brahms ended in the home key or not.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I wonder if you'd like to fire a question back the other way at Steve.
Absolutely. I came first in contact with Steve's brilliant work when I read The Singing Neanderthal, back then when I was a senior lecturer at Sussex University. And we've met in between and he has published a brilliant paper on music and social bonding together with colleagues in a very prestigious journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And I have a very pressing question that I have been wanting for a long time. And it goes like this. So humans, that is the Homo sapiens, can hold a beat in a group. So they can clap together slower, faster, they can accelerate, get slower, that apparently no other vertebrate species can do. And sometimes something that I presume is the simplest mental function, the step from animals to humans, and possibly already from animals to early hominids, that is, from animals Homo. Now, Stephen, how likely do you think that this ability, so to hold a beat in a group, to clap together, sing together, dance, was already present in earlier hominids, that is, earlier species of the genus Homo, before the Homo sapiens?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question, and I'd like to think I know the answer to that, because I think that this capacity to hold a rhythm, to coordinate with others, to entrain with others, I think that's a consequence of the evolution of bipedalism at around 1.8 million years ago. Now, we often think about bipedalism as just for walking, but in fact, there's very good arguments from human anatomy that there was much for endurance running as for walking. And we all know from when we've been at the gym and on the treadmill, the importance of keeping a rhythm to be energetically efficient when you're doing that. And we know how when running with others, maintaining the same pace also helps enormously in terms of running efficiently. So I think from the emergence of bipedalism, for people who don't know that, that means we're walking on two legs. Obviously, it frees the hands for other reasons, and there's lots of arguments why we came to evolve bipedalism. I think a consequence of that, an accident from that, was the ability to maintain a rhythm and entrain with other people with a rhythm. And that gave a lot of selective advantages in terms of running together, working together, foraging together. And as a consequence of that, we also gained an ability not only to train to run together, but also to clap together, to dance together, to sing together. So I think this evolution of bipedalism about 1.8 million years ago, I mean, it was quite gradual, but there was clearly a turning point around that, was also a turning point in our musical abilities. And in one sense, our transition from other animals occurred then, and that was the first stage of it. And then I think the second stage of it was around 100,000 years ago when we invented words. So our musicality, I think, really began with bipedalism, and it had all sorts of consequences for that.
I find that utterly fascinating, and that sparks another thought. Because if they develop bipedalism, it also means that in the beginning they lived on trees, went, away from trees. Could this also be the origin of hierarchical thought or stimulation of hierarchy? Because they do something here, they went on the tree, they go down from the tree, do something else, go up so they begin to plan actions in hierarchical ways?
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea, and there have been arguments in the literature about how the processing of environmental information, understanding your landscape, requires some form of hierarchical thought. I'm not entirely persuaded by that yet, but we know that around this 2 million to 1.8 million times, there was huge changes in all sorts of behavior, not only bipedalism, but increasing use of stone tools, increasing use of eating meat, probably increasing food sharing, changing sociality. So it might be within that nexus of changes that hierarchical thought emerged. I rather doubt it. I like to think that hierarchical thought somehow evolved to enhance the type of verbal communications that we have, which is why I like the ideas of trying to understand the role of hierarchy in music. Why do we like it? Why do we find finishing on the same key pleasing, whether or not we perceive it or not? Why does that emotionally make us feel right? So I'd sort of like to throw that back to you. What is it about hierarchy music Why is it there? What's it doing? What's the function of it?
Yes. Well, if we perceive the hierarchical structure, then usually we perceive it as kind of relaxing because it's the sequence appears closed and doesn't. But as I said before, it's with longer sequences. It's that non-absolute pitch possessors actually hear this. They hear on whether something sounds finished, but they don't hear it on larger scales.
Yeah.
The reason why this developed, because I anticipate you asking, why did it come then? Why did it come into play with Baroque music or even before? Then my guess would be Baroque music, different keys sound very different because the well-tempered tuning was not in. And before that, if you tuned, let's say, cembalo in D major, and then ended in it sounded very different from D major. So that would have been unpleasing for the audience. So that might have been why it developed back then to close a piece in the same key where you. I guess it became a habit and a tradition that carried on even when the well-tempered or the tempered intonation was used.
Okay, thanks. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
It's utterly fascinating. I'm so enjoying this, and I think what it shows is that we're approaching these ideas that should, right at the forefront of research. There's so much that we know, and we know that both of you have published really seminal work in these areas, but you're standing at this kind of edge of what we know, and then asking questions. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think listening to both of you, it's really interesting to think about how musical ability evolved. I think it's really fascinating to think about it being to do with walking on two legs and that kind of rhythm that you get. But also it kind of shifts our conversations about music, doesn't it? Because if we're starting to see music as something which is quite fundamental about being human and actually fundamentally important to human evolution, it means that rather than just thinking about it as a kind of spin-off, we're actually saying, what could have been the benefits? What could have been the advantages? And what's the selective pressure? And you can imagine, Steve, when you were talking about humans falling in step and then music starting to evolve, you can imagine that individuals who had, just by virtue of the variation that would be there in a population, individuals that had a better ability for music might have a bit of an advantage. And you can see how that then spread through the population and how natural selection might actually have promoted that. And I think that's fascinating to think that there's been a selective advantage potentially for music. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. But I think it's these aren't just rather arcane academic matters we're talking about. It's really important to our society today. It's the reason why we need more music in schools rather than just maths and English and science. We need kids singing together and dancing together and making music together, because that's all about building up their sociality, their ability to cooperate together, work together, enjoy together. So I think placing music in an evolutionary basis and showing how it's fundamental to us as being human should really have an impact on our society today and what we recognize as important for building good well-being in individuals and in communities.
That's such a good point.
And that, of course, is why music is also very good for personal therapy as well, as Stefan has written about extensively.
Yeah. We will come round to that, I'm sure. I've got some questions coming in from our live audience. That's fantastic. So I'd like to ask you some of those. And there's a question here for Stefan. How would you explain the striking differences in musicality and feeling for rhythm between individuals, even if they haven't had any musical training? So how do you explain that variation, Stefan?
Yes. it's very difficult to an ultimate scientific answer, because you would kind of technically separate children after birth, random, then conduct studies with them over the course of and for ethical reasons that's not possible. But there is ample evidence that training hugely modifies the musical abilities. So as soon as you start training your perception or your of rhythmic and small time intervals changes, so the acuity to increases. If you play another instrument where you have to produce the pitch yourself, then your pitch perception more fine-grained. If you have your fingers, then the motor representations in the brain increase, and the connections in both hemispheres that connect the motor neurons, they increase and they get thick. It gets quicker to transfer the information between both hemispheres. Evidence that musical training and engagement, if you will, active musical engagement, modifies hugely the abilities between individuals with regard to rhythm and dancing, etc.
I suppose it's like a lot of human features that there is variation, there is variety amongst us. I've got a question for Stephen here about symbols. Stephen, here's the question. Ian Tattersall claims that the capacity to create symbols is the real boundary between animal versus human language. Others suggest that animals may create symbols, such as, for example, urine for cats to mark off their territory. But the difference is that only humans connect signs together to generate new meanings. Do you think the notion of symbol can also be defined for music?
I certainly agree that creating symbols is important. What definitions of symbols is quite challenging. Whether cats and other animals marking territory, putting a symbol down, I think marking the territory should be defined as a symbol. I'm not entirely sure. And of course, we've got some evidence that other types of humans, like Neanderthals, were beginning to make symbols, maybe fairly late in their existence. But we've got some evidence they're making symbols. So I think making symbols is important, but I'd very much see that as a consequence of having spoken language, rather being an underlying capacity from which language emerges. I'm not sure whether you can describe music as having symbols. The reason for that is a symbol, we have a shared meaning. So if I have either word or a badge or a flag, and I wave my flag around, other people will know that I'm talking about this particular country, or we have a shared meaning for it. One of the weaknesses of music, I think, is that we don't necessarily have a shared meaning for it. We have shared emotions from it, but if I hear a music, whether it's piece by Bach or whoever, I might interpret that with some meaning, some narrative to it. But you, Alice, or somebody else might interpret it in a very different way. We don't really have a shared meaning for it. We may have shared emotions about it, but we don't really take inferences from it. It's what Stefan said earlier, music is weak on semantics. So I think if it's weak on semantics, I'm not sure whether we can talk about music as being symbolic, if you like. It incites emotions, expresses emotions, but in my mind, it's not really a symbolic system of communication in the way that spoken language is. I don't know whether Stefan would think differently on that one, but that's my view.
Yeah, I would agree. Of course, language is, every word has, most words have meanings, as at least all the content words. And you have more like, for example, the James Bond theme Bond and not Batman, for example, yeah? Or television jingles, my cell phone, etc., etc. So these things, it's not that because the James Bond melody say things like James Bond is here, or James Bond arrived, or James Bond was here, or something. So, as you said, it's language is much better with symbols than music is.
That's really interesting, Stefan, because I mean, what you're saying there with the theme tunes is that we've learned an association, and so you can use that piece of music as a symbol, but it's not as straightforward as a
Absolutely.
word.
I mean, think for example, also, so thus that it would be wrong to say cannot symbolize anything, but this comes not anywhere close to that of language.
You'd be fairly limited in your sentences, wouldn't you? If all you could say was James Bond, Batman, Star Wars, James Bond. I've got a question which taps into something that Steve was just talking about there. That the kind of the way that music invites emotions, creates emotions, and that was something that you talked about, Stefan, in your lecture. And that was, really fascinating. And I was fascinated by the idea of the universality of that. I don't think I was aware of that. I didn't realize that, that seems to be something which is universal across all human cultures. It doesn't seem to be something that's learned, that a happy upbeat song will always sound like a happy upbeat song, depending on, it doesn't depend on which culture you're in. So there was a question about emotion from our audience, and it's this: is the kind of emotion stimulated by verbal language different from that stimulated by music? Can there be an emotion which is not driven by semantics?
So yes, there can be is not driven by semantics. So music can play with our expectations generated by syntactic structures, features of music, not semantic features, and that emotions. So a chord can sound surprising, feel tension during a deceptive cadence. We feel sensation when the deceptive cadence is. We can be certain or uncertain what tone or chord will be. So those are elicited by music, structural features, not by semantics. And with regard to emotion, by language and music, it's find that we actually have two systems, a voluntary one and an involuntary one. And the voluntary one evolutionarily new and required, and the involuntary one is older. We share it with other primates. Old involuntary system produces emotionalizations, and it colors our voice, the tone when we speak. And this older emotional system, by the way, is always active. Use our speech with emotion, always, even when we try to hide it. And that's why, for example, a good doctor doesn't hear what you say, what's wrong. He can hear it in your what's wrong, or that something is wrong, and a voice will help the doctor. A good doctor actually is actually wrong. And this old emotional vocalization is important for music, and it also operates independent of semantics. Just two examples.
I think that's absolutely right. I think musicality trumps words every time. Because Alice, if you asked me, "Hey Steve, how are you feeling today?" I say, "Oh Alice, I'm really sad. I'm so depressed. It's awful." You just wouldn't believe me, because you'd hear the tone of my voice, the pitch, or if I said, "Oh, I'm really happy today. I'm full of the joys," but you just wouldn't. You'd ignore the words. You listen to my tone of voice, you look at my gesture, my body language, and you infer from that. You ignore the words. So I think musicality trumps words when you're trying to express emotions every time.
So that's interesting, because what you're pointing out there is the inherent musicality in language. And of course,
Yeah.
some languages are more musical than others, but all language has an element of musicality. So what I'd like to ask both of you is it possible to have language without music? What do you think, Steve?
Spoken.
Not really, not fundamentally. And of course, musicality has different levels of skills, abilities, just way some people suffer from aphasia, where they lack a linguistic capacity because of aphasia. We also have people who suffer from amusia, and they, because of pathology, they lack ability to engage with music. Actually, I think I suffer from quite a lot of amusia as well. Amusia, actually. I have great difficulty following pitch, and I'm actually not very musical. I don't think that's because nothing to do with my evolution. I think I just have a bit of a strange genetic defect somewhere that I'm not terribly good with music. But even with that, and even with people who suffer from severe amusia, I think they get musicality to some extent in their gesture and in their speech. And of course, if you listen to the great orators of our time, whether you go to Barack Obama or Winston Churchill or whoever, the musicality in their speech is just amazing in terms of their variations of pitch, their variations of rhythm, and they're engaging with an evolved sense of musicality in all of their listeners, because that's the way they know it's going to have that most effect. And of course, they're doing it unconsciously. They're not aware of that. They're just doing it. So I think they do overlap. I don't think you can have expressive language without some degree of musicality there, but I'm not an expert on that. Stefan might be able to answer that much better.
Yeah, well, even individuals who are not good at rhythm or pitch or so understand whether I ask a question,
yeah,
or whether I make a statement. Okay, they can by the voice recognize whether I'm, sad. They can timbre whether I really want them to do something or whether I'm, asking. And also adding to what you said before, that some people have no sense of. Yes, I am aware that some people are really at it, but if you listen carefully, they still with the contour that is going in the right direction. They still clap, they're not completely off. So for me, it's all, let's say, a matter of error tolerance, if you will. Cultures, everybody is considered musical. There's no such thing musical or non-musicality or so. So aware that colleagues try to find neurological individuals who are really bad at, with them, but we do not really have any concerns yet, in my view, at least.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions that overlap, talking about the differences between spoken language and then gestural languages. And this is quite an interesting one, which I think might be for you, Stefan, but Steve, you might have a perspective on this as well. You observe that both music and language consist of sounds, but what's the status of those languages that can be expressed by signs only, by gestural language, signs, in other words, like American or Italian Sign Language? Are they substantially different from those languages which use sounds? Stefan?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, because no, they're not in the brain. Which also seems to be processed in music language network in the brain, as I call it. Interestingly, the more narrative language becomes, the more comes the part of the brain into play. Thus, the more of the music network comes into that. The more narrative assignments, the more reminiscent the activation get to the processing of. So the more, research, for example, has processing of words, sign language, as opposed to telling a story in sign language. Its story is told with sign language, then the activations in the brain become much more perception than when single words are processed. Then the activation like language in the brain, spoken language.
So it's similar patterns of activation to spoken language and therefore to music as well.
Yes, well, as I said in my lecture, music and language are processed very similar in the brain anyway. So there's this overlap structures and brain activations and brain activity. That's why I speak of the the music language network in the brain, rather of two separate music and one for language. The only thing is that language is typically processed more strongly in the left side of the brain, and music is typically processed in the right side of the brain. Still in both hemispheres, but there's a certain thing. And with sign language, this is also active, the music language network in the brain in both hemispheres for language, but the more narrative the sign language, the more active the right hemisphere becomes, more reminiscent the activations are to the activations to music.
Thanks, Stefan. I must say, I mean, listening to your lecture and learning from you tonight, it was one of the things which I've always puzzled over, the fact that you have these networks, and on the left hand side, that's where you're processing language, and I'd always thought, presumably those networks are there. What are they doing on the right hand side? And you answered that question. They're doing music. Steve, I've got a question for you here. Languages differ from one another. Well, again, it might be a question for both of you. Languages differ from one another. And once you spontaneously acquire your own language, or more, if you're exposed to many communities during your early childhood, this is fixed. Is there anything similar for music? Are there differences such that after childhood, one cannot feel the same way for different musical systems? So I suppose there's two questions there. How fixed is it? And then is it similar for language and for music?
All I can say is I don't know, really. That's out of my area of expertise. We know about acquiring languages, that there's a period in childhood when you can acquire several languages almost simultaneously with the same ability. Then after a certain time, trying to acquire a further language becomes more challenging, and you're using different parts of the brain to do that. Whether it's the same in musicality or not, I simply don't know. And I think probably this is a question for Stefan, because my impression, and it's only impression, it's much easier to engage with other musical traditions than other musical languages. So when I travel around the world, when I go to China or when I go to Jordan, and I'm with, say, Bedouin communities there or Chinese communities there, I can't speak their language, I can't communicate, but I can actually relatively easy sing with them and engage with them and dance with them. And that seems to make a much easier connection with people from other cultures, even if I have no linguistic ability at all. So it seems to me it's easier to engage with other traditions of music quite rapidly, and build a social bond through that, than it is to learn other languages. And in fact, other languages actually act to make a distance, actually, to prevent any social bonding if you really can't understand what somebody says. So it's much nicer to sing and dance with people than it is to try to speak with them sometimes. But Stefan might know about acquiring, through childhood acquiring musical skills and abilities. That's out of my domain.
I'd add here, I find it a beautiful question and a very, very, I haven't even thought about the question. Colleagues have. I'm not aware of any research that has been carried out in this direction. Of course, we all can learn new music when we are older. No question about that. Question is whether the new when we are children or young has a specific or very special emotion. I grew up in Germany. Now I love Norway. I'm so happy here. This is I don't want to go back. But when I go back to Germany, I don't want to move back. But when I go back to Germany to visit, for example, then being in Germany has that I will never get here in Norway. It's very difficult to bring across what exactly it is. Everybody who moved out of a country and come knows what I'm talking about. And I think it's very similar. We experience and learn and get used to in early childhood, go away from it and come back. It has a special.
It's kind of being homesick without being homesick. There are so many more questions coming in from our audience who are really engaged with this, but we are going to have to draw it to a close, I'm afraid. It's been absolutely wonderful this evening. What an absolutely fascinating discussion. And I've learned so much about where we're at with this science, but also about where the questions are. And your research is just such an extraordinarily exciting area. So thank you so much for your presentations and this lively discussion tonight, and for answering all of those questions from the audience. And I'm sorry I haven't been able to fit more questions in. Thank you everyone who's joined us live and contributed by sending in those questions. The recording of this conversation will stay up on the Fondazione Prada website and their YouTube channel, together with video lectures from this evening's experts, and all the rest of the sessions as well. So do go back if you haven't seen the rest of the sessions. We've had sessions from lots of different people, very pertinent to tonight. The very first session that we had was about syntax as the fingerprint of human language with Angela Frederici and Robert Berwick. Some of his ideas we've picked up in discussion tonight. So I do hope you'll follow us for the rest of this exciting series. The next conversation will focus on just how adaptable our brains are, how plastic they are, and how we can harness that plasticity to become more efficient learners. The video lectures then will be delivered by neuroscientists Jeffrey A. Klein and Alvaro Pascual Leone, and they'll join me for another live conversation and Q&A on Thursday, the 17th of February. Stick it in the diary. So I hope you can join us then. As always, those two lectures will be available for 10 days on the Fondazione Prada's website before we have that live event. And you're also very welcome to send in questions in advance as well as on the day on that live session. Until then, from me, Alice Roberts, from our distinguished guests, Stefan Koelsch and Steve Mithen, and from everyone at Fondazione Prada, goodbye, keep well, and stay curious.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this, Alice.
Thank you, everyone.